There we go. Well, thank you so much for being here. I must say that I'm very nervous, and I don't usually get nervous. When I called Dr. Kissinger in the fall and asked him if he'd be here in April, you were my hero. You were booking 9 months out last September. So I think everybody here wants to know, what's your secret?
For what? For surviving? I chose my parents well.
And I want to thank Starkey Hearing Technology for being the sponsor of this really awesome opportunity to hear from really one of the great statesmen that this country's seen. I'd like to start, if you don't mind, with your personal story, because that seems to shape so much about how we view the world. You were born in 1923. You arrived in the U.S. in 1938 at age 15. You went into the Army in 1942 and served until 46. Given that experience, especially serving in the war where you were an intelligence officer, how did that experience shape your worldview as you went into your professional career?
Well, you have to understand, I came to this country as a refugee in 1938. And I lived in New York, working during the day and going to school at night. So my military service was my first contact with American life as a group, because I served in an infantry division, the 84th Infantry Division, which came from Wisconsin and Illinois. And so for me, the Army was my first completely American experience. And I had the honor of serving first in the infantry, and then later on, when we entered Germany, I was moved to the T2 section, which is the intelligence section. So my attitude in academic life, I was at Harvard during the Vietnam period, when there were demonstrations and various kinds of attacks on the then administration. I always had a different view than many of my academic colleagues, based on, in a way, having been rescued from a dictatorship, and then from my Army service with the division, with the 84th Infantry Division. And that had a big impact on my attitude towards the big issues during the rest of my life.
So you stayed in Germany a little bit after the war, and your experience there, I'd like you to comment, because in many respects, your story and the immigration is the ultimate form of globalization. When you look at Europe today, and you look at the rise of Leaders for Life or the rise of nationalist parties again, do you feel that this populist move that we're witnessing in Europe is the beginning of a repeat of what we saw early in the 1930s and even before that?
Well, of course, I was very young when the fascists developed in Germany. But I think the sense of frustration with the existing institutions it's one of the causes for this populist reaction, that the period of inspirational leaders seems to be diminishing. And in a way, the rise of these populist leaders is partly due to the failure, largely due to the failure of the governments that have been in office.
And do you think that the alliances and that the forces around our democratic institutions are strong enough to hold against these threats?
Yes, I do believe that it's that, but the politics in all democracies has become a skill, more of a skill in presentation than a development of convictions. And when that becomes dominant, the public feels that it is really being manipulated. And therefore, they're not willing, they become reluctant to undertake sacrifices. But great things cannot be done without a willingness to sacrifice some of the present for the future, for your children and grandchildren. And when that attitude weakens, then every setback becomes hard to bear.
Right. Now, you have written about one of the challenges of democracy is balancing the long term against the latest public opinion poll. Do you think that true statesmanship in a Twitter world is possible?
Well, you may find it hard to believe. I have never consulted Twitter for anything. So I'm no great expert from that point of view. The essence of statesmanship, as I have understood it, is this: the task of a leader is to bring his society from where it is to where it has never been. And in order to do that, you need vision and courage. You need to be able to imagine what doesn't yet exist, a better future for your people. And then you have to have the courage to withstand the attacks from those that have to alter their attitudes. That, I think, is the essence of statesmanship.
I couldn't agree more. Let's talk about an example that took both vision and courage. In 1971, your and President Nixon's desire, because we had a common adversary in Russia and the Soviet Union, to forge an opening with China. There was a trip to Pakistan. You had reported that you were ill and that you were going to rest. The convoy was a decoy, and you got on the plane to go to Pakistan, with the president of Pakistan to China to meet Zhou Enlai, and spent about 49 hours on the ground talking to him. How challenging that moment of meeting a world leader that we didn't have relations with. There weren't the traditional briefing papers and intelligence reports that are commonplace today. You had to go meet a world leader without the public eye. Explain, in your mind, what that was like.
Well, the first problem we had is when it's that President Nixon did not tell anybody in his administration that this trip was taking place. So we could not ask for the normal briefing papers. And the reason President Nixon did that, and people will argue about that, is that in the middle of the Vietnam War, leaking was huge. And he thought that if the effort became public, there would be such a debate about the conditions we should make and that it would never take place. So the first thing was to organize a trip by the security advisor, which we made around Asia, wound up in Pakistan, and then we had arranged with the government of Pakistan to fly us to Beijing. The reason we chose Pakistan is because China was in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, and they had no contact with most countries in the world, and they did have one with Pakistan. So it was difficult. And I was lucky in the sense that Zhou Enlai was a person of some academic attitudes. So if you read the transcripts that are now public of our conversation, it sounds like two college professors talking about the future of the world. And the reason we did that on both sides was the following. There were so many disagreements between China and the United States that if we started with any of them, we could get deadlocked. So we thought the first thing was to establish a way of talking to each other. And so that led to a sort of strange dialogue. I was in China in order to elicit an invitation from them to President Nixon. But I didn't want to say that. And Zhou Enlai didn't want to say that. So I had 48 hours, and we both knew it. So at the end of the second day, as we were breaking up for the evening, Zhou Enlai had some official function. He said, what should we do? What should our staffs do for the evening? I said, well, they can start drafting a communique. And Zhou Enlai said, can they mention the trip which hadn't been mentioned of Nixon? And I said, what trip? And he said, both trips, which meant my trip and Nixon's trip. So that was a great breakthrough. But it was a strange setting. And if I may, I had one other problem, which the president will understand fully. I was talking to Zhou Enlai, but I knew that President Nixon wanted to be the first person to see Mao. So most visitors asked to see Mao, and I went through contortions to avoid asking to see Mao. He had given orders, we now know, that to bring me to him if I asked for, as soon as I asked for it. But I never asked for it. So this was the problem of internal relations in our government. And President Nixon was absolutely right in reserve that for himself.
Great. Now, you have gone on to say that in the co-evolution between China and the U.S., you said it's very hard to have regular dialogues because when you take a conversation of a typical American president and a typical Chinese president, the American president has 10 issues that he wants to solve. The typical Chinese president has 10 destinations he wants to get. So there's a difference of perspective. Let's talk about today, if you will, where we see Russia and China having some common interests in having a conflicting relationship with us. Do you view the same opening you saw to go reestablish relations with China? Do you see China and Russia being drawn together because of their conflict with us?
Well, in our period.
Today.
Yes, but in the period in which I functioned, there was a obvious conflict between Russia and China. So we calculated that if we could succeed in placing America in a position where we were closer to each of them than they were to each other, that we would have the maximum bargaining position. That was our basic strategy. In the present situation, the United States is in conflict, or in a kind of conflict, with both China and Russia. That, of course, then weakens our we cannot then use that relationship as in the same degree, but as a practical proposition for American diplomacy, we should avoid, if we can, being in conflict with two major powers simultaneously that have access to each other. So, but that's a principle we can't always follow.
Do you see that the United States and China, given their competing interests and the rise of China, do you see that coexistence being established peacefully, or do you worry about the theory of a rising power and a declining power always, or not always, usually ending up in a military conflict?
Historically, it has led to conflict because it's the essence of a rising power that it steps on the feet of the established power by the virtue of its increased scope. But we are now in a really historically different position, which is that weapons technology has developed in such a manner, not only with the destructiveness of weapons, but with the artificial intelligence that is evolving among, say, inanimate objects, that to unleash the full capabilities of either side on the other would have an impact, in my opinion, equal or greater than what destroyed Europe 100 years ago. So I believe it will be a task of any president to see whether he can find an honorable way of avoiding a major war with China, but at the same time to prevent China to use that restraint from expanding its influence in a threatening manner. That's a huge task. President Bush dealt with it in his period, and it's become more acute since.
And you were quoted as saying once that the difference between Russians and the Chinese, this is what you said to President Nixon, the difference between the Chinese and the Russians is that if you drop some loose change, when you go to pick it up, the Russians will step on your fingers and the Chinese won't. Do you think we can have a three-way trusting relationship between the three powers that be today?
If you mean by trusting a relationship like exists among people in America,
Well, let's call it an equilibrium, a stable equilibrium.
it's a big challenge. And it's very difficult because in the nature of things, politics never stands still. So new issues come up all the time. But the world is now evolving in such a way. In my 95th year, I've become fascinated by the problem of artificial intelligence for this reason, and have started some groups that address this, because our leaders now have an unprecedented challenge, which is that inanimate objects become part of the equation. So that has to be clearly understood. And the traditional pattern of diplomacy and foreign policy, in which countries faced each other in a series of showdowns, it's particularly difficult and for a country of the magnitude of the United States to apply. So I think we have to rethink our strategic approaches. And this is why institutes like this one here can raise issues that in a day-to-day operation you don't get to so easily. But it's one of the key issues of our period.
And you wrote a fantastic article entitled How the Enlightenment Ends. You wrote that last year in The Atlantic. And you said information threatens to overwhelm wisdom. And when you were talking about the critique of artificial intelligence and the lack of human judgment, with that rise, do you feel like diplomacy and statesmanship is losing its place?
No, it's not losing its place. In a way, it has a bigger place, but it has to be restudied. And it has to be understood now that the traditional way of military confrontation, especially between countries of the magnitude of China and the United States, have to be reconsidered. And one has to think, we still have to think of a kind of containment of the aggressor. But the containment has to be more subtle and take into account more factors than has been the
And
case.
do you worry as you think about rolling back technology, we have certain actors, China in particular, that's using big data and artificial intelligence as a means of population control with their social credit system. And then you have the people that approach technology as the ultimate democratic tool of transparency. Do you believe that we can reach some common understanding as to how to put that toothpaste back in the tube and really control it rather than let it get out of control?
How you change the historic attitudes of societies. I mean, China, this is not just a problem of a leader. In China, you have a society which for thousands of years has been educated that service to the society is the overwhelming necessity. And therefore, it is part of their DNA. We have been fortunate of having a very humane environment, and so we have been able to concentrate on our immediate problems. Chinese think more of that will take a while to adjust. And I have a view that not everybody shares, which is we cannot change directly the domestic structure of a historic society, but we have to live with it in a world but we can also not turn the world over to it. And how to navigate, this is what I'm assigning to this center.
To the center. Thank you. We'll take that on tomorrow. So if you were to advise a young person today, would you advise them to study computer science or humanities?
I'm not a good person to ask that question because I'm an argument against universal suffrage in my knowledge of computer science. But I would, as a general rule, say the society must have a basis of humanistic knowledge. Of course, they have to know computer science, but I take that for granted. But you cannot handle the global implications of computer science if you don't understand a humanistic tradition.
Good. I'd like to shift gears and talk about a dilemma and see if you can help shed some light. Today, Iran has been described as a murderous regime, and we need our alliances. One of our allies in the region is Saudi Arabia. Yet the Khashoggi murder, as well as the human rights and humanitarian issues in Yemen as a result of the war, make it difficult for us to be all in on that alliance, yet we need to have some commonality relative to a common adversary. How would you advise that we navigate that dilemma?
First of all, I don't want to leave the impression that I have an answer to every dilemma that a president faces. And there's some dilemmas that are not easy. A basic problem of Saudi Arabia is that it is historically a feudal society put together through agreement among various tribes. And so it has a tradition of government based on these realities. That is, in many of its manifestations, deeply offensive to us. And there is no way we can accept acts like the Khashoggi. And if it became a typical pattern, it would make our relationship extremely difficult. Now, the Crown Prince, who is responsible for the murder, at least indirectly, he's also trying to modernize the country, which means he's trying to move its feudal structure into a more modern, bureaucratically organized. So we are bound to be in dilemmas along the way. And we have legitimate objectives in the security of Saudi Arabia, but we also have traditional views in which we cannot condone assassinations of this type as a method of government. And every administration has to work this out to some extent. If Saudi Arabia disintegrates, we will be in for a long period of chaos. And no president can forget that. But if Saudi Arabia doesn't modernize, it might disintegrate. So it will always, I don't know how to answer that, except to be conscious of it and to, what I think we need with dilemmas like this is a recognition in our country that serious people are trying to deal with grave problems and not turn every domestic debate into an issue of a moral failing of the leaders, so that we can learn from the debates and not torture ourselves by saying it is a kind of a civil war.
And so speaking of leadership, you've had relationships with some of the world's greatest leaders in the last 50 years. This is a forum on leadership. What, in your mind, are a couple of the essential traits to great leadership today? And who, in your mind, embodied those traits as a great leader? And people in the room are okay to reference.
Well, as I've said before, the combination of vision and courage are two elements. I did not know President Bush when he was elected, or barely knew him. I have developed enormous admiration and affection for him. And I always list him among the top leaders for that reason. He inherited an extraordinarily difficult situation that had all the elements that I've described here. And he made the difficult decisions. And he, even when common sense on the short term would tell him that they were very dangerous, and he did it with serenity and not ill will towards his opponents. And so I came here today for 3 hours and an 8-hour plane trip and consider it an honor to have been asked.
Thank you for that. Our goal here is to create content that has great take-home value. I'm going to end it on that wonderful comment about vision and courage and the cautionary tales of how we need wisdom in a day of high technology. It's an honor to have you here. I want to thank again the Starkey Hearing Technologies Company for being an underwriter. of this great conversation. It's an honor for me to share a stage with you. Everything we've heard this morning has been live streamed and will be on our website if you want to reference it again. And I look forward to seeing everybody this evening at the gala at the Mansion on Turtle Creek. Dr. Kissinger, you're a national treasure, and I want to thank you so, so much.